Okay, great. So again, this is Clayman from the NEMSIS Technical Assistance Center in Select City. Thank you for joining the V3 implementation call today on June 27, 2018. We have some exciting news to share that will allow us to move forward. We'll work through the agenda. I have Josh has the screen for the webinar right now. He's going to start off by sharing some great information that he's collected regarding an assessment we asked him to do in regards to the Schematron process of providing business rules. What's working, what's not working, what innovations or changes could be made that would improve that process both for our providers and for the states as they kind of move forward with kind of ensuring that rules are in place to increase the validity of their data. So, Josh, I'll turn the time over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Clay.
Josh, right before you begin, though, I'll ask if folks would be so kind as to mute their phones. We're getting a fair amount of feedback. So if you would be so kind as to mute your phones and then unmute them if you have a comment, would welcome comments throughout the presentation. We're still hearing that feedback, so if you haven't muted your phone, if you'd go ahead and do that, that would be great. Good. Okay, great. Perhaps, no, we still have it. That's true of the...
Tony Fernandez, check your mute.
Oh, Tony, okay. Hey, Tony.
It sounds like we
Tony.
I just muted Tony, but I still have someone else.
Oh,
Chuck,
okay.
Wisconsin.
Clay, do you want us to just go ahead and mute everyone? Oh, might have gone away.
Chuck, maybe that did it.
Okay, yeah, it sounds like it did. Okay, good.
All right, I'll try unmuting Tony. Then we'll get started here.
Okay.
Okay, so Chuck, if you need to speak, you'll need to throw something into the chat box. Oops, I'm going to keep Tony muted too. Chuck and Tony, chat if you need to speak. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Josh Legler. During the month of May and June, I conducted a Schematron assessment. The purpose of this assessment was to see how things are going with the use of Schematron in the NEMSIS version 3 standard and identify any potential changes or adjustments that should be made going forward. I had three major areas that I focused on in the assessment. Number one was the national Schematron rules and asking the question of how can we improve their readability? How can we improve the ability of people to understand what's in those rules? I reviewed state Schematron rules. One of the questions there was, is there anything in the state rules that lots of states have implemented that should become national rules? But along the way, I think I ended up discovering a few other things in state rules that were helpful to know about. And finally, I did stakeholder interviews to ask questions of vendors and data managers. You know, what's working well, what should be changed as we move forward. So first, I want to share a few slides that I shared with the data managers when they met for the National Association of State EMS Officials meeting in Rhode Island last month. So data managers who were there, these first few slides are going to be a repeat for you, but I thought it would be helpful for all of the vendors on the call to see information that I shared with the states last month. Then I'll follow those with some slides regarding recommendations from this assessment. So one of the things I looked at in the national validation rules was this question of, we have some validation rules in the national Schematron files that cover a lot of data elements in one assertion. And so if the assertion fails, it'll list out the data elements that were involved. So for example, based on incident patient disposition, the following should be recorded. And if someone left all of those blank, then all of those will be listed. If they only left one blank, then just one would be listed. The question was, should we go with more of a format like this, where it's implemented as an individual assertion for each of those constraints. So, having one assertion that lists out what was left blank versus having an assertion for each thing as an independent atomic assertion. So that was something that I looked at. Another thing I looked at was just the identifiers for the patterns, rules, and assertions in the national Schematron files. They currently look like the line above. They're fairly descriptive in terms of the topic area and what they address. I saw that lots of states have gone with IDs that are just simply numerical. And so you might just kind of over time, you might learn that rule number 23 is the rule about cardiac arrest and resuscitation or things like that. So looked at that, whether or not we should simplify or shorten the identifiers. And then the other thing was whether it would be helpful to include the national Schematron rules embedded in the data dictionary pages. So here's an example for dagency.15. Here's the data dictionary page as it currently exists. And the idea is to add a new section called validation rules that would list out the national validation rules that pertain to that data element. So that was some stuff that I looked at for potentially modifying in the national rules or things at the national level. I reviewed state Schematron rules. About 35 states have published a Schematron schema for their NEMSIS 3 data, so that's great to see that many have done it. Only Oregon and New York have published a schema for demographic data at the time that I ran this assessment in May. And you can see the number of rules or assertions in state files ranging from 337 for Colorado. The median is around 149. That's where New York is. And some states that only have one Schematron assertion in their Schematron schema. I looked at the content of the state Schematron schemas and did find a few issues that we would want to address. Here's one example. There were 14 different states that had some sort of rule that says that patient care report number is mandatory. Well, the XSD says that patient care report number is mandatory. If the patient care report number is missing, then it will fail XSD validation and it won't even run Schematron validation. So these rules are redundant and will never be triggered in Schematron validation because they get caught at the XSD level. So that's a potential area for improvement that we could help states to identify those rules that are not necessary because they're already in the XSD. Also rules that are already in the national Schematron files. So here's an example, different states saying that incident zip code is required or mandatory, missing, whatever. Lots of different ways to say it, but they're all basically saying the same thing. They want incident zip code to be filled out. There's a national Schematron rule that already says that. So what happens here is it's redundant in a different way. The user sees two messages. They see the national validation rule message, plus they see the state validation rule message whenever they leave out incident zip code. So they see the same message. The same problem causes two different rules to fail, a national rule and a state rule. Okay, so that's what I shared with the data managers last month at the NEMSIS meeting. Just quick look at some of the potential areas that we can look at improving our use of Schematron in NEMSIS 3. Next, I conducted stakeholder interviews the first week of June, about 10 hours of interviews with 8 software vendors and 10 states or regions. I put regions in there because I interviewed a LEMSA in California. So that's it was about a 50-50 mix between vendors and states. And as I conducted those interviews, I've compiled a summary here of recommendations in several different categories related to Schematron. The first category I'm attempting to identify is whether there should be any changes to the NEMSIS Schematron requirement, kind of to to, like if you look at the NEMSIS v3 Schematron guide, there's certain things in there that say that software must be able to do or software must not do, stuff like that. And the message that I heard from multiple stakeholders was to avoid changes to those requirements, keep them stable. People have implemented under those requirements, and for the most part, they've been successful in those implementations, and it'd be good to keep things stable. Next, I looked at changes to the national Schematron schemas. And two of the potential things that I just showed you a minute ago were echoed by stakeholders in the interviews. Most stakeholders would like to have constraints be more atomic. So that first concept I showed you, where one assertion covering lots of different data elements would be split out to be lots of different assertions, each one covering exactly one data element. And then also, I noticed that a lot of the data validation rules that states had implemented were simply rules that were conditionally requiring some national data element under certain situations. We have a lot of rules like that in the national files, but perhaps they're not as comprehensive as they could be. So the recommendation here is just to go through every national element in the NEMSIS standard and identify whether there are any conditional constraints for that element that should be included in the national Schematron files. So that for the national elements, we'd have a really complete set of validation rules, and the state validation rules would really not need to do much about national elements. They could really just focus on state elements. The biggest area where most of the recommendations come is just documentation and resources. Just things that the NEMSIS TAC can do to provide increased or improved documentation or other resources for vendors and states to use. So the first one, which I showed you that sample, is to integrate the national Schematron schema documentation into the data dictionary pages. I think that'll really help with clarity and visibility of those validation rules. That anyone, someone at an agency level trying to understand what the validation rules are, when they go to a data dictionary page, they're going to see the rules for that data element right there. They don't have to go over to the Schematron files and try to find them there. Another recommendation was to create a state Schematron rule library. You might recall we have a custom element library that NEMSIS has published, where you see a map of the US and you can browse all of the custom data elements that have been defined by different states. So this would be the same idea, but we would be looking at Schematron rules that have been designed by different states. The hope here is that as states are considering rules that they might create in their system, they could go out and see what other states have done. And then we can generate more consistency among states if they coordinate more with each other. Next was to provide a reference implementation of Schematron rules that would validate data based on state data sets, including custom element data. So some states have custom elements. Those custom element data is not really validated by the XSD. I mean, there's some basic validation there. But you need element-specific validation for the custom element data. So the NEMSIS TAC could provide a reference implementation of a Schematron schema that would validate custom element data based on the custom element definitions that a state had put into their state data set. Or other validation rules regarding, like the licensure levels that a state recognizes, and so on. Next, stakeholders asked for more guidance on developing, testing, and debugging Schematron schemas, just best practices and so on. One recommendation was to create an actual software API library. So there would be like a Java class or a .NET class, et cetera, that would be kind of a self-contained API for running NEMSIS Schematron validation. So software vendors could load that and deploy it in their system. Next was to educate states on the purpose of state Schematron schemas, how they're helpful to local agencies and their vendors, how it impacts their ability to comply with state requirements. Also to educate states on the impact of their validation rules. What happens when you change something from a warning to an error, or when you introduce a new rule, but some data from last year gets posted after you've introduced that rule, things like that. And also, it was requested that we provide some information that would clarify the difference between what is already covered in the XSD schema versus what's in the national Schematron schemas. That example I gave of patient care report number being a mandatory element is a good example of that, the need for that clarification, so that people will understand that that's already in the XSD. And then technical assistance, a couple of recommendations, 4 recommendations here. This represents assistance that the NEMSIS TAC would need to provide the states kind of on a one-by-one basis. One would be to help states remove redundant rules from their state Schematron schemas. So that'll make them more lean, and they'll perform better and be easier to read. Help states with versioning and change control as they make changes to their rules over time. Discourage the score-based rejection of records in state systems. A record should be determined to either be valid or not valid based on whether it has any errors in data validation. Some states have done a score-based rejection where if it has over a certain number of warnings or over a certain score or under a certain score, then it gets rejected. And that's quite ambiguous for local level vendors and their agencies to implement. And also, stakeholders have asked if the NEMSIS TAC could review the content of state Schematron schemas when states submit those for publishing to the NEMSIS TAC. It's a somewhat labor-intensive process, but several vendors reported that there have been state Schematron schemas that, yeah, they're valid schemas, but they had bugs in their logic and would trigger things to fail when they shouldn't have, and would disrupt the flow of data. So, to what extent can the NEMSIS TAC help to catch those logic bugs? The vendors would love it if the NEMSIS TAC could do that. Finally, there were just a couple other recommendations that are broader in nature. One was in web services to define a structure for record-level processing results. If a batch of patient care reports is submitted, some of those patient care reports could have errors on them, while maybe the rest did not have any errors. And the Schematron guide allows for receiving systems to process each record independently and to say the records with errors get rejected, but the records without errors will be accepted. The problem is in the web services standard, there's no standard structure that has been defined for the receiving system to tell the sending system exactly which patient care reports were accepted and exactly which ones were rejected in a batch scenario. And there was a need expressed by several states that they need to be able to accept partial or invalid data. They need to be able to accept a record that's not complete yet, it doesn't have a back-end service time yet, it's missing information, maybe it only has a patient name and birth date and a unit notified by dispatch time, but they want to be able to get that record, send it over to the Health Information Exchange and do a search there for patient demographics and patient medical history. They want to be able to receive that partial record, and then maybe later they receive the complete record as an update. Or they want to be able to receive and accept invalid data. So a patient care report fails validation, but the state wants to know that they got it, and even though it has failed validation, they want to be able to have that record in their system, and then they can evaluate the data quality and assess it and provide feedback to the submitting agency. The standard really doesn't allow for that. The standard says that if a record's invalid, it should be rejected. And so don't know how this would be implemented, but there has been a request to support systems in their need to receive partial or invalid data. All right, so that's a run through. That was a lot of me talking, but I want to open it up for just thoughts and feedback from all of you. This is a rundown of the key recommendations that were found through the assessment. I'd say in summary that overall what I found was that Schematron has been fulfilling its intended purpose in NEMSIS version 3, allowing national and state level validation rules to be applied at a local level consistently. So while there are challenges that can be addressed, I think the overall goal has been fulfilled, which was good to see. So any thoughts or questions or comments from everyone on the call today?
Josh, this is Ridgely. The one about not allowing or discouraging people from using a score-based rejection, I'd never thought of that, but that is actually kind of brilliant, I think. But you're saying don't do that. Can you tell me, like, I didn't even know that it was feasible to do that. Can you, like, who's doing that and why is it so bad? Because it seems like if somebody has a really low score, that record's crap and it should be rejected.
Yeah, so some states are doing that rejection based on a score where they say, since you had, say there were 2 errors and 5 warnings, Schematron warnings, when we processed this patient care report. That's a total of 7 failed problems. So because the number is greater than, let's say, 5, then we're going to reject that record. Well, those warnings are just that, they're warnings. And by definition, a warning should not cause a record to fail or to be rejected. The errors should cause it to be rejected. If there's even 1 error, then it should be rejected. But they could have any number of warnings that could be legitimate. The reason for warnings, one of the reasons, is because they may be a rule that generally applies in most scenarios, but has some exceptions that just can't be accounted for. And so you may get a warning on that report, but you may say, no, that's really what happened. We really didn't have that piece of information, or that sequence really was out of sequence. And so the standard says there's only warnings. That's a valid report. It gets tough for the vendors and agencies at the local level to implement that score-based validation idea.
That doesn't actually, the way you described it doesn't really seem like score-based to me. It seems like I was thinking in terms of, like, in the image trend world, there's the you can assign a certain number of points to an issue. And I was thinking, depending on how you define your number of points, that it would kind of make sense that if you got to a point where there was over a certain number, I don't know. I can see both sides of it.
The problem with the scores is that we don't have the algorithm that generates the score at record recording time, so we don't know what the score is going to be until later, and so then it comes back from the state, and we have to push that score all the way back to the agency at that time. So if we had it ahead of time, that'd be fine. There is a scoring for some states that's built right into the Schematron rules, but most of the places where scores are used, that is not the case. So we don't have it, so we don't know what it's going to be until whenever. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the services need to be held accountable for sending good data, and it's not, and it isn't all on the vendors.
So I think maybe the suggestion there would be that if you're going to do scoring, it should be included there in the Schematron so that we can try to catch it at field collection time as opposed to after it's processed by the state.
Right,
yep.
Yeah, that could be considered. That would represent an update or a change to the National Schematron Guide, the requirements. Currently, it does not cover the concept of rejecting records based on a score.
Does Schematron capture like how many points you assign to an error?
Not unless you put it in your Schematron file, but there's no national standard for that.
Okay. Yeah, there are currently 3 states that do something like that. It's just the rule has a custom field in it. Basically, you can parse out and get a score per rule. It's not a score for the record overall. It's just it puts a level on the warning, I guess. Might be the best way to say it.
Okay.
Yeah, good discussion. Thanks. Other comments or questions?
Yeah, Josh, it's Mike from New York.
Yes.
Hey, just a little more on the last discussion. I would be concerned about building a scoring into the national schematron because I think it takes away the ability for the states to choose what the score would be, what a failing score would be. I mean, Ridgely may score something as a if you don't do this, it's a -1. I may want to look at something and score something as a -50. So we have.
And that's probably the way it would roll.
Yeah, yeah. But if we were to build such a thing into the national schematron, then every state is locked into the national schematron. So I would be, I would just caution that from the beginning if there are any thoughts of going this way. But it's an interesting thought. Thanks for letting us know that folks express that to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Any other comments? Okay, great. So this will be, I delivered a more complete document to the NEMSIS staff. So Clay has more details that you can read through and then determine project plans and things to focus on over the next year or two. I want to thank all of the states and vendors who took time out of their schedule in early June to meet with me for a phone interview for 20 minutes or so each. Really appreciate that contribution that all of you make, taking time out of the busy schedules that you already have in your state or in your software company to contribute to this broader national level effort that benefits everyone. So thank you again for those of you who took the time to meet with me and share your thoughts and insights. So Clay, I think I'll pass it back to you.
All right, thank you, Josh. Appreciate that very much. And just a couple of additional comments regarding the work that Josh did. The timing was strategic. We had hoped that there would be some firm recommendations that we could discuss as we move forward with a potential next version of NEMSIS. And so that's worked out very well. And I think what we'll do is make the broader report that Josh has provided to us. We'll make that available, and then as we continue to walk through the process of looking at what would be efficacious for us to change in a version 3.5.0, we'll take into consideration kind of attributes of this report that folks at the DMC and other stakeholders feel would be valuable steps to make it more efficient and effective as a process for checking data validity. So we'll keep this as an important topic. It will certainly be covered in our meeting on August 20th and 21st. So again, we'd love to have you attend. So I've requested Josh to actually share my screen. Do you see that? Okay, there we go. All right. And now, do people see the agenda on their screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. All right, so thank you, Josh. Appreciate that very much. I think that this will be really helpful moving forward. One of the heartening pieces of this review, as I looked at what Josh provided, is that people feel like this is a process that is working for data validity, and we're clearly seeing the increase in data quality here as well. We really haven't had an opportunity to report on how clean we feel the V3 data is compared to the V2, but I'll tell you, it's I know it's just subjective kind of opinion right now, but the data does look much better. And as folks know, we're wrapping up the 2017 data collection, which will all be V3, and we'll all be able to kind of take a look at that national data and how it compares to the V2 data. And I think folks will find that this has been a successful process for us to implement in version 3. Okay, let's move through the agenda if we can. We've got a couple of other things we want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about. first and foremost, wanted to let folks know, probably most of the data managers are aware of this, and I'll provide just a little bit of background to put this into context. So during the annual and the SEMSO reading that was held in Rhode Island last month, the DMC made a formal request of the Board of Directors for NEMSIS that they accept the work that they had participated in looking at potential suggested revisions to the NEMSIS standard. Many were rejected. There were some that were suggested to move forward, and those were presented to the board as those that were marked as Agile on the Excel spreadsheet that's found on the NEMSIS website. So a motion was made for the board to approve those suggested revisions that were marked as Agile, meaning that we had the information necessary to move forward with those, that those be approved and the process for a 3.5.0 standard move forward. That was reviewed 2 weeks ago on a call where they just didn't end up having the people necessary, I think, to be able to call a formal vote. Many people had to drop off the phone, and the DMC motion was held late in the call. So a special call was held just this last Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and there was a 30-minute discussion about the recommendations from the DMC, but the final motion and vote of the Board of Directors in the SEMSO was to move forward with the motion that had been provided by the DMC. So we have received from NHTSA our marching orders that we are to now go ahead and act on those suggested revisions that are marked as Agile and to begin the process of formalizing those revisions. So as folks know who have walked through those, clearly some of those revisions that are, definition changes, misspellings, those will be easy for us to demarcate, make perfectly clear what will change in the XSDs, while others are probably still need further refinement, right? So some of those pieces could still benefit from more technical discussions about how best to implement those. So we will start a process next week where we are walking through each of the suggested revisions. We will finish up a formal kind of look to those that are pretty straightforward, and that will allow us to be able to identify those that need additional work, and we will begin to do that work on these calls during the summer, and then that will probably be a big part of the annual meeting on August 20th and 21st. I'll remind folks that, let me see if I can bring it up, that in the past, so folks probably haven't seen this just because it's been so long since you've had to see one, but here is the formal release of changes that we have done in the past, right? So here is what's called the change log when we moved from 334 to 340. And so this is the document that was formally released that allowed vendors to take a look at what changes needed to be made to move from 334 to 340. Of course, they had the new XSDs and the new XML structure, but still they could walk through this and make sure that they understood each of the changes. And so we had a table of contents that really listed like general items to begin with. So were there changes to common types and to simple types? Were there things that were deprecated or removed? And then we would walk through each of the sections, each of the D sections and each of the E sections in the NEMSIS standard that were affected by a change. And then we just walked through each of those changes. And I know I'm moving through this quickly. Here's like the deprecated elements or values, elements removed. Folks will remember we removed the therapeutic hypothermia between 334 and 340. That was the only kind of a major change with an element removal or addition. And then you can just kind of see that pattern changes or values that were added, all those were listed here for each section, right? So for the deconfiguration section, here were the changes. So we hope to be able to do this again, of course, but we're thinking what might be more valuable is for us to have a more real-time document that's being developed so that vendors and state data managers can be actively reviewing what has kind of been finalized and what is still under discussion, so that you can ensure that, you know, at no time does the NEMSIS TAC like misinterpret what we thought the decision was and how it was to be implemented. That way we can make sure that everybody has a common understanding. So my first question I wanted to ask of this group is, as we're trying to think of a more dynamic mechanism for reporting and kind of recording the approved revisions as we're moving forward, what kind of format would work for folks, right? So would it be best for us to just have a living document that as we walk through sections, we just add things to a document like this, and so that you can be reviewing the new additions to a dynamic document as it develops, or is there some other mechanism? Should we be using JForums so folks can go in and make comments on the final structure of a change, or something like that? So I just wanted to throw that out as a question. We want to make sure that as we're moving forward, we've made great strides trying to be more transparent, and I think this is another area where we could be more transparent, is actually demonstrating how the technical fixes are going to be implemented as we begin to refine the process that will bring us to a candidate release for a 3.5.0. Any ideas as to what might be a good way to communicate that work as we move forward?
Clay, do you guys have, as part of your Stash subscription, access to a JIRA instance?
Oh, that's a good point, Rich. I don't know. I can take a look at that. So, could you describe what you're thinking about a little bit?
You could track each potential change as a ticket in JIRA against a project specific to this effort, and people can kind of vote up and vote down, and it keeps a pretty good history log. That's one option. I was just thinking, if you've got my suggestion would be something like the forums that we used on the first round of all this.
Right, the J forum. Yeah, but this approach, yeah.
Clay, this is Lisa. Could I? Oh, I'm sorry.
What it would take to expose JIRA to multiple outside users.
Could you say that again, Josh, and then Lisa? Would love to hear your comments.
The NEMSIS TAC does use JIRA internally, so they do have JIRA. Just a question of how it would look exposing it to multiple outside users as opposed to just internal staff of NEMSIS TAC.
Right. Right, Lisa, did you have a comment on that idea?
Yeah, I was just going to actually say the same thing Josh did, so thanks for that. I was on mute.
Okay.
We actually use JIRA to manage all of our internal projects, so I can certainly investigate what it would take to have one that was accessible externally.
Yeah, if you look at the forums and the ticket tracking that Atlassian uses itself on its products that's exposed through their site, they use their own product for that, so you can kind of see how that works if you're interested in looking at something that's active. And, you know, that way we can kind of vote up and vote down issues, that kind of stuff. It's just an option if it's already something you've paid for.
Yeah, great. I think that's really a good idea. So we'll take a look at that. Sounds like a good approach. Other ideas that may be able to kind of improve our ability to make sure folks are right up to speed into what's being discussed in regards to a technical implementation of a revision, of a change?
I'd like to know kind of the high-level changes that have been implemented, like if something has been accepted or rejected, that be able to see that. Like in the last week, these ones have been accepted or rejected. The problem with the J form is it all jumped around. Somebody added a comment saying, "Okay, I understand. That's the top of the list now." That ordering didn't make a lot of sense.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, David. When we were discussing each of the potential revisions that people would mention, kind of the conversation and how that revision could be modified to make it actually be valuable or work. I kind of jumped around. It's kind of what you were talking about. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I got that feeling too in JForum. Okay. Right. Other comments in regards to kind of a process for transparency there? Okay. Well, I think this is a great option. So we'll look into this and try to begin to provide some feedback, and so that all of the stakeholders will be able to kind of track what we're considering kind of being finished. And as I mentioned, we'll start with the misspellings and the other kind of pieces associated with the NEMSIS standard that we feel like we can probably have all the information we need to make the technical change. Clearly, there will be other items that will need more discussion. We'll look forward to including everybody in that process as well. And that kind of leads us into the next item here on the agenda, and that is to just make sure that folks are aware of the resources that are associated with the implementation meeting. So now that we have this decision is made, we can really move forward in regards to organizing the agenda and the meeting that will be held on August 20th and 21st. We're thinking that it's going to be really driven by an extension to these calls, right? So we're gonna try very hard to have good organized discussion on these calls, saving items that would be best being discussed in small work groups until the meeting. So we hope to make some good solid progress over just this next month on some items that we think will need more attention than others. And then we'll look forward to meeting together in Park City here on August 20th and 21st. Lots of time spent in small working groups, and so that we can have some good directions to just finalizing the process of the changes that will be part of 3.5. So with that being said, it will be important, if you feel like you will be attending, we'd love to have you sign up earlier rather than later. Because I'm thinking that we will be organizing work groups before we arrive there. So we'd like to have a feel for how many people are interested in certain topics, how many breakout rooms do we need. And so as we develop that very quickly over the next couple of weeks, we'd love to have a list of people who will be attending that meeting. So if you could register earlier rather than later, that would be helpful. There's lots of things kind of associated with the meeting that are listed here on the website. As you can see, there's the registration site. We have a draft agenda, which we will now change now that we have a firm direction in regards to 3.5. A request letter to attend. We've added a document that describes some really good transportation options to get from the airport to Park City. With Lyft and Uber, I think that'll be a much easier process now. We've also defined an evening social event that's going to be happening on that first night on August 20th. That's part of your registration. That should be a lot of fun. We're going to be doing some activities on Park City Mountain, and then also we're going to be adding to the agenda that you'll see on that Sunday night. We're going to have a marshmallow roast down in the back area of the hotel on that Sunday night. Is just kind of a NEMSIS gather the night before the meeting starts. The new hotel we're meeting in has a much more kind of an intimate feel to it, and there's fire pits out in back of this hotel that will allow us to roast marshmallows, make s'mores, and just have a really nice evening on that Sunday night. So please, if you get a chance, go ahead and register so that we can get that meeting organized as well as possible and make it be valuable for all those who attend. So, all right, so that moves us through item 3. Any comments about the meeting? Is there any other resources we could provide that would help people or the decision makers provide permission for you to attend? Okay, all right, good. All right, item number 4, we sent out an email on the DMC listserv talking about the idea that we are very close to closing the 2017 National Data Collection. So this, of course, is an incredibly valuable part of the entire NEMSIS process, right, where we finally are able to aggregate a final data set that we make available that does not include any of the elements that are thought to be sensitive that would identify a geographic area, all the way up to submitting state or a provider or a EMS agency or a receiving hospital. All those are removed, and we make a research data set available. We probably send out, I don't know, Bridget probably sends out 4 requests for data every week. So it's literally requested often with great hypotheses, great research that's being done on a national level. So this is clearly another part of why NEMSIS is valuable. Hopefully it's making great changes at the agency level as they can look at their data, and then the state level, and then at the national level, being able to look at kind of overarching issues. This is the data set that allows us to do that. So we just want to make sure that we have all of the 2017 data that we could possibly have. So if you're a data manager for a state or a vendor and you feel like you've got records for 2017 that are version 3 that we do not have yet, we would love to hear from you in the next week so that we can get this thing closed down, cleaned up, aggregated, and released. We always try to release the data set the 1st of August, and so we need July to get the data clean and to get it into a format that our researchers are able to use. So I'll just call the question, is there anybody who knows now that they probably need to speak to Lisa just to make sure that we have all of your data? Okay, well, feel free to email her. I know that Karen made a heroic effort as she was trying to kind of finish up her work with us to reach out to everybody and make sure that we had all the 2017 data that we could possibly have. It's clearly a transition year. We're going to drop from about 30 million records in the national data set to probably under 10 million. But that's to be expected as we move forward with version 3, and we've probably already clipped that number for 2018. So it's clearly just the process of a major revision from version 2 to version 3, and we'll get everybody back on board, and it will be just as robust as it has been in the past with version 2. Any other questions related to us closing the 2017 public release data set? Okay. All right, great. We're able to march down through these things pretty quickly. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what's happened just recently in regards to harmonizing with CARES. I talked to the DMC a little bit about this, but wanted to talk to the broader group as well. So folks will remember that part of the voting, there was a suggested revision that we try again to more closely harmonize with CARES. That was strongly supported in all of the surveys that were provided, and we knew that was going to happen. So we've been working with CARES since last summer, actually, to try to better harmonize. And it's been a good road, in that I think both the CARES side and the NEMSIS tax side and NHTSA has had a better understanding of the two standards. So that's been helpful. It looks like we had a question, Bridget. Let's see. Did the call drop for anyone else? And so, Rich, did you get dropped off for a moment? Or maybe he's still up. Are other folks still with us?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so maybe it was just Richard. Yeah, Rich, I don't know what's happening. Yeah, it looks like maybe you have dropped out. Please, please feel free to join us back. So I think the harmonization between CARES and NEMSIS has been slow to do for a number of reasons. Mostly related to the fact that CARES truly is a registry of a specialized sample that is cardiac arrests, where NEMSIS is really the standard for a medical record, a pre-hospital medical record. So some of the philosophical ideas associated with the registry have been very hard to kind of make work in the NEMSIS standard. So a real easy example of that is when we were working last summer with CARES, they were concerned that we had that there was the option under gender to not only list male or female, but to also list not applicable. And so for a registry, that's an important issue because you want to have complete data. Having not applicable in there seems really silly because there really is only two genders or some kind of mixture of those two, but clearly not applicable could not be a valid answer. And so, but clearly as a medical record for EMS, we have lots of situations where we receive EMS activations and no patient is found, and so clearly that's a valid value for us. And so we've had to work through a lot of those issues in regards to mapping. It's been really good discussions. The latest discussions that were held were in Rhode Island, where NHTSA, Dr. Cromer and his team came together with CARES and with the NEMSIS team on a Wednesday morning there at the hotel, and we walked through how best we thought we had been able to harmonize over the last 9 months. Clearly, there are still real issues related to that, so I'll just bring you up the latest sheet that CARES shared yesterday on their conference call. And for each of these sections in CARES, arrest witness, arrest after arrival of the 911 responder, and they have a very specific definition for 911 responder, for example. You can see just in what's this column here, the change that would be made either on the CARES or NEMSIS side. So the CARES group is recommending a fair number of changes on the NEMSIS side. It would represent, I think, if we just accepted this document without further kind of discussion, I think there'd be maybe six additions to the E-arrest section, and some would still feel a little bit duplicative. So we have some more work to do. So we've asked the DMC if there are folks that wanted to formulate a small working group, and David from Georgia, Chip from New Hampshire, Doug in Nebraska, and Juan in Florida has volunteered to help us with that. I wanted to know if there were a couple of vendors who have had some experience trying to make the two standards work and looking at their where the two standards line up well and where they don't line up very well. If there was a couple of vendors who may want to join that working group, would love to have you join us. If you would just send me an email, that would be very helpful. And we'll try to have that work group begin their activity in early July by passing along this document and some other documents where folks have been able to do some additional mapping. And we'll also bring the CARES folks into this work group and see if we can resolve as much of this as possible over the summer, and so that it can be included in the 3.5 revision. So any other comments about what's been done? Yeah, please, Josh.
Gosh, just one additional comment for the vendors to think about in terms of as they think about how they can help here. As we met with CARES, I think they come, from the perspective, kind of that pure research perspective of here's exactly how we've defined this CARES data element, and here's why all these little bits of the definition are here based on our experience over the years. And if we use this existing NEMSIS element doesn't quite match up with the purity of the definition that we've come up with in CARES. And then I think we've heard, or at least have a sense, that there may be some vendors who are generating CARES exports and that they are in fact going to those NEMSIS elements that are close but not quite and are mapping the data from a standard NEMSIS element to the custom element that CARES wants. And if that data mapping is occurring, I think it's helpful for the CARES staff to be made aware of that so that they can understand that while there may be a pure research definition and intent for an element, the real world implementations are using mapping in order to reduce the burden on providers, and that if they could adopt the NEMSIS standard element, they're going to get the same information. That it's just that the vendor won't have to map it to get there. Anyway, there's kind of that tug of war between kind of the purity of the research perspective versus the pragmatic nature of what happens out in the field and what's easy for providers to fill out. So vendors with experience who have perhaps done some mapping to make CARES exports happen, I think that experience in particular would be really helpful to share.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. That was great additional information. Thank you. All right, fantastic. So yeah, if you feel like you have a little bit of time this summer to kind of volunteer to help with that process, would love to hear from you via email. All right, fantastic. Just one more formal item I just wanted to cover, wanted to update people in regards to the position that we are trying to fill that Karin did such a great job of fulfilling for just so many years, the state support position here. I just wanted to let folks that has been out there. We've sent out the link to the position to both the Data Managers Council and on the Google group. We would welcome applicants from both who have been involved in NEMSIS either at the state level or on the vendor side who feel like this would be a position they might be interested in fulfilling. I'll just mention a couple of things. We've had some questions come in related to the position. So number one, you wouldn't be required to work the crazy hours that Karin decided she wanted to work with that job. So I've had several people say, well, does this mean I have to put in 60 hours per week? And the answer to that is no. This would just be a regular FTE 40-hour position. It is full-time. We have removed the leadership responsibilities that were associated with Karin's position. So Karin was always balancing kind of the management position here within the TAC with state support. So she kind of had double duty. We've removed that in hopes that this person could spend more time concentrating on state needs and on vendor needs. We're also I've kind of opened it up to the idea that person would not necessarily need to sit at a desk here in Salt Lake City and could still fill that position. So if you know of anyone who you think might be interested in this position, we'd welcome having them with us. And it continues to be an exciting time as we try to help states move to version 3, and as that data set grows and becomes more valuable and more valid and clean and reliable, it's going to just be a great next 5 years, I think, in regards to the NEMSIS work that we do. So just let you know that that's out there, and we received some great applicants associated with the position, and we're hoping to start to interview next week. Any questions regarding the job posting? All right, great. Well, thank you very much for the support that you've provided us in the past. We miss Karin here. We're getting used to a new normal here, but we're looking forward to filling the position to make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs as quickly as possible. All right, I'll open it up. Are there other items for discussion that folks wanted to bring to this call that we could discuss as a group? All right. Any other thoughts that have spurred in people's minds related to any of the topics we covered today? All right. Well, thank you very much for joining the call. We ended up having a very large audience today, so thank you very much. Everybody's very busy in the summer, so we appreciate that very much. Our next scheduled call will be July 11th, as listed there on the schedule under item 8, and we look forward to meeting with you again at that time, and we will have made some progress in regards to the development of the meeting in August 20th. So please feel free to join us up in Park City on August 20th and 21st. Thanks, folks.
Thanks,
Clay. Mike Taylor.
Thanks, Clay.
Clay?
Yes. Hey, Mike, how are you?
Hey, can I, you got 10 minutes I can call you right after here?
You bet. Give me a call.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, sir.